Hey everyone, coming at you from Vancouver, BC here. Just waiting a few moments. Thank you we're just, taking some time to let everybody shuffle in. We have a lot of guests and audience here today. Really grateful. My name is Leena Minifie. Oh, I'm muted. Okay. Checking. All right. Okay, so live right now. All right, so it seems that my mic issue's cleaned up. I am here from Vancouver, BC, coming at you from the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish territories that I live and work on. I acknowledge that I have relationships with these people, and I've been in and out of these territories for a long time. I am Gehachla, Giswadwada. I am Killerwell clan from northern BC on my mom's side, and I'm third generation settler from my dad's side. I am a digital strategist as well as a film marketer and a producer. I help also people with impact producing with my digital strategy. I am at Cool.World now. I'm one of the co-founders here, and so this is who's presenting the Salon series that I'm happy to be part of. So this is our decolonizing digital strategies Salon series, and today specifically is the rise of BIPOC Media Data and Distribution. We have an amazing lineup of guest speakers that I'm so honored to be in the room to be able to discuss with, ideas about audience and strategies and reaching our audiences on digital space and being discoverable. So we have today Shivani Saini, founder of Creators Empowered, the CEO of Atelier Culturati from Calgary, Alberta, Delphine Levins, senior box office analyst at Gower Street Analytics in London, UK. We also have Elizabeth Mondenio, community manager, Racial Equity Media Collective, REMC in Toronto. Caden Douglas, the executive director of BIPOC TV and Film in Toronto, Ontario. And I just really want to thank everybody for putting this together today because we've had so many people behind the scenes. But today our technician is Darcy Hamilton. We have some of our coordinators, Della Haddock and Melissa James, who've set this up, and the wonderful Bella C, who will be taking audience questions throughout this webinar. So with that being said, I think we can kind of start with the first section. So I wanted to let you guys know that we have some learning outcomes today. So if you've joined us and have come here, I'm hoping to kind of share a few particular things. So I think the learning outcomes for this salon personally is empower BIPOC creators and their comfort using digital marketing terminology and strategy. I really would like us to identify some challenges and barriers in our discussions of what is being asked by BIPOCs to sort of creators in our grant applications and how we can get past that. I'd like for all of our audience members to really kind of understand audiences, to get past these challenges in defining who our audiences are, considering a lot of the times we're comparative to like mainstream and niche, as opposed to talking about our own audiences. We really want to just deconstruct the concepts of mainstream and niche in our digital content plans and break that down, and really decolonize niche markets and what that terminology is, to be really specific and name our audiences and be proud of who our content is representing, both on the screen, but who it's going to and who's interested. So with that being said, I'm going to actually invite Shivani Saini to come have a conversation with me. And how the show will happen is I'll be asking questions to each of our guests. Hi, Shivani.
Hi there.
I'll be asking questions to you, and then at the very end, we'll take a question from the audience. So we'll be able to actually answer questions as we go, and there'll be a longer portion at the end too that we'll leave space for those questions to our guests.
Awesome.
So thank you for joining us today from Calgary. So you started Creatives Empowered how long ago?
Creatives Empowered was established just at the end of November in 2020. It was an idea that I had in 2019, inspired by work I'd seen in the country from other fantastic orgs like Real World Film Festival and Screen Institute, BIPOC TV and Film, Racial Equity Media Collective, Just at the end of 2020 seemed like the perfect time to create that type of space, to create that kind of community in Alberta for BIPOC artists and creatives.
Well, thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to talk to you. I was going to ask you, my first question is, what are the key barriers and challenges do you think for BIPOC creatives, and what do they face today in their career goals, as well as making their projects and getting them out?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I don't know that we have enough time in today's salon to really get through all of the challenges. Just before I jump into answering that question, just on behalf of Creatives Empowered, we just really want to thank you for creating this space and for inviting us to be a part of it. I'm super excited for today's salon and what we're all going to learn from it. So I can answer that question and provide a broader context to this discussion, specifically from my perspective as a racialized producer and consultant who's been in the industry for over 25 years. So those professional experiences involve film and primarily television production, and exposure to international distribution. And I think, to state and overstate the obvious, the key challenge to date for BIPOC creatives when it comes to making, selling, and distributing their films, their shows, their content, of course, has been inequity. It's been the systemic racism within Canada's screen-based industries and other screen-based industries in other parts of the world that also cater to westernized audiences, to audiences of the dominant culture. So within the last year, that level of awareness around the existence of systemic racism has obviously been raised, and we're now starting to see that needle move, so to speak. Truthfully, I'm seeing change and opportunity now that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime as a professional of color. But prior to, I'd say 2020, prior to the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report in 2015, not much had changed in the previous 20 or so years of my career. So for BIPOC creatives, making, selling, and distributing films, TV shows, digital content was exceptionally challenging. Funders, commissioning bodies, and distributors often operated on the assumption, and perhaps still do, that their audiences were predominantly white. Despite the fact that Canada's growing population over the last 20 years has continued to become more diverse, and also despite the fact that Indigenous populations in urban centers have also increased in that time. And so stories that catered to that assumed audience were always very highly valued, and generally speaking had a better chance of receiving funding than authentic narratives from BIPOC creatives. So that's kind of a general overview, but within that, again, speaking from what I saw, there were some other assumptions about audience that were made that I think are still relevant today. So one of those assumptions is that those predominantly white audiences just genuinely would not have an interest in BIPOC narratives or content. Another assumption is that any BIPOC perspective that might be presented within a narrative or a story would need to be made more palatable for those predominantly white audiences. And this assumption is quite significant because it would directly impact the content. So it would impact how that story is written. It would impact how that story was made. And it would ultimately impact who was making the story. And as many of us who are BIPOC have seen, often in the past, there were BIPOC narratives being made by folks who don't come from BIPOC perspectives and identities. And this assumption would also perpetuate the negative stereotypes and tropes that we would often see of racialized people within the mainstream media content that was put out. And then within the assumption that audiences are predominantly white is another troubling assumption that BIPOC audiences didn't actually exist. So, I mean, within that, there just is a lack of acknowledgement of the presence of folks who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So as a result of all of these assumptions that I saw, another assumption that would logically follow is that BIPOC narratives and stories just wouldn't sell, that there was no market for them. And to provide, I think, some more context on the impact that these assumptions about audience can have on a BIPOC professional, in particular, someone that might be emerging or someone that's mid-career, I can use myself as an example. So those assumptions that I saw about audience in my time working in television production and seeing how distribution functioned, those assumptions affected my career because they were a deterrent to me telling my own stories.
So may I ask about the assumptions? So what kind of assumptions are being made, and what must have been true for these assumptions to kind of exist when you're talking about?
Yeah. So do you want me to give you like a specific example of assumption? Well, okay. One example that I can give you that might help to break down the types of assumptions is I'm South Asian. So often whenever I would see any type of representation of a South Asian person, say in a mainstream film, in a mainstream television show, there was a homogenization that would take place of that South Asian identity. And the South Asian diaspora is huge. It's very diverse, it's very complex. But every time I would see someone that was meant to represent South Asian identity, they were homogenized, they were stereotyped. Often, it was a stereotype of an immigrant that had moved to a certain place, somebody with an accent. Very rarely would I see individuals that perhaps were first or second generation just being represented as who they were as individuals. And so, like within all of the content that I would see, and within even some of the decision making around how stories would need to be written, how content would need to be presented, there just was always this concern, this drive, this need to make what you were seeing more palatable for that assumed audience being predominantly white. That's typically what I saw.
Yes, and my experience as well. And talking to people sort of about your ideas and sort of about your pitches or the stories that you'd like to see in front of the camera, and like to see distributed. Was there any hesitations about you selling or sort of making or creating for your own audience?
Well, I mean, truthfully, because it was so clear that these assumptions about audience were just part of the system, that I would have such a difficult time trying to even convince a funder, a commissioning body, a distributor. It would be so difficult to even convince them that there was an audience outside of the one that they assumed was there. From my experience, from my perspective, I didn't really feel like it made sense to even try and play the game. Like to simplify it, if you know that the deck is already pretty stacked against you, but you still want to be able to gain experience and have a career and do the work that you want to be doing, you have to start to become strategic about the choices that you're making, about the battles that you pick. If the deck is stacked against you, then why play the game, right? Maybe there are other ways to engage in the medium so that you can still get what you'd like to get out of it as a professional. I'm summarizing, I'm generalizing in terms of what I've had to do throughout my career.
And I feel the same way. We've sort of talked about this before, and I've had the same experience where I've left the film industry because trying to pitch these stories, trying to get them through. Years ago, like over a decade, there was this general sentiment like, oh yeah, people won't really be interested. There won't be an audience for that. So thank you for your time. It's kind of wrapping up now, but I'd like to open up to the audience if there's any questions specifically for Shivani. So I'm going to just take a look at our questions from the audience. Sure. So what has helped you persevere through your challenges that you faced during your career? That's a really good.
Oh, gee. Okay. Well, I think that most people that get into the business because they just have such a passion for storytelling. They have such a drive to be telling specific stories or to be involved in helping great stories get out into the world. And truthfully, despite the challenges I faced in my career, and despite even being deterred at some point from actually telling my own stories, there were still so many other stories out there that I could still get involved in and help to support. And a lot of the other work that I've done has involved raising awareness of BIPOC narratives in other mediums, also in other disciplines, in other parts of arts and culture. So truthfully, that passion that I have for storytelling is, I think, that driving force within me that has been there from the time I was a little girl. And in the context of today's world, with the kind of incredible change that we've seen, and again, like with the kind of opportunity that's now opening up for BIPOC content creators, I'm finding myself reignited. I'm finding that passion within me for storytelling being reignited, which I think is, really great and really exciting. And then what's so fantastic is now we're seeing so many other BIPOC content creators stepping forward and wanting to have their voices, their narratives, their stories heard. So, it feels so wonderful to finally be in a place where now I feel like I'm being seen. And I know I'm not the only person who feels that way.
For sure.
But what's also really great is if you think about that in terms of past context, really what that means is that we were always here.
Yeah, you didn't have to scratch very far to find somebody who's been in the industry for a long time trying to make their content. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Shivani. We'll
My pleasure.
Hopefully get some more questions to you at the end. But thank you for representing Creatives Empowered and starting that collective in Calgary too. If people would like to see more of Creatives Empowered work, we can put up sort of the the Twitter and Instagram where they can reach. And I'll be moving over to talk to Kaden right now. So
wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks. So hi, Kaden. Thanks you for joining. And congratulations. It's really great to know that you've kind of come into executive director in the recent months. And I know there's been lots of demands on your time, and BIPOC and TV's film's work right now has been really increasing. So if you want to talk a bit about sort of what you do, that would be really great to sort of intro, and then we'll talk about how the barriers of content, how that's being lifted, and how we move forward.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having us here today. Lovely to be on a panel with all of these amazing individuals. BIPOC TV and Film is a nonprofit grassroots organization that was founded about almost 10 years ago. We'll be celebrating our 10th year anniversary in 2022. Our main focus is on advocacy in terms of amplifying BIPOC creatives, and also addressing some of the barriers that exist within our industry so that we could achieve the full economic participation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color within the film and TV sector. So a lot of the work that we do is providing opportunities for people to increase their skills and also to have access to paid job opportunities. Mm-hmm. And we do so right now through our online database hirebipoc.com or embaucherdiversité.com. People could check out. We currently have almost 6,000 individuals on that platform of job seekers, employers, recruiters. So it's really exciting to see that we've provided a space for people to actually be discovered.
It's wonderful. When Hire BIPOC came out, I was overjoyed, and I'm so glad you guys have put the work into doing that. Most of us find in our jobs that we are always like sort of fending these questions about how do I find this person and this position and who do you recommend? So that tool is remarkable and will be forever valued. So coming back to Shivani and sort of her experience, I'm sure you've heard a lot of people talk about within our television film, we're even talking about media arts and making AR, VR, that people are finally starting to get their stories sort of told, but we still have this, we still face this challenge of kind of describing who our audience is. Yeah. And really right now, during the digital transformation, we need to think about discoverability. And so I'm wondering personally, where are you finding content these days? And how easy do you think it is for audience to find content? And we're talking about BIPOC content specifically.
Like personally right now, where I'm finding most of my content is online on YouTube. And that's been the case for many years now, where I was trying to find content showcasing people who look like me, people who look like the communities that I am part of. And also just sharing some diverse narratives within that as well. Like a lot of times we get stuck in a single story of what it is to be Black, what it is to be Indigenous or South Asian as well within our media. I may have to tell a child to quiet down very soon.
We just roll with the pandemic time.
Full-time mom, part-time executive director. Yeah. So I watch a lot on YouTube, even sometimes on Vimeo as well, in terms of finding great content in that way. And now with the emergence of these different streamers, you find like a lot of way in terms of seeing things that are by BIPOC creators, specifically on Netflix, even on Amazon, even locally here on CBC Jam and on Crave. I've seen a lot more Canadian content seeping through that, and Apple TV as well. And I think that's also because there's a concerted effort to showcase that content, to have different categories where you could easily find that. So that's where I've been watching a lot of it now. And I have to say that I am one of the people who've unplugged. I am of the unplugged generation. So a lot of it has been through streaming platforms and online communities and film festivals.
And film festivals for sure.
Yeah.
So you represent one person in the audience out of many people that are trying to get to. So if you're part of that audience demographic and you're seeing BIPOC people trying to get their content out there, what are you seeing as the challenging concepts behind what's labeled as sort of Canadian content, or what the baseline audience is right now?
Yeah. The tragedy is that Canadian content is still being seen and defined as very white, middle-aged, skewing a little bit more conservative. That's what's really being seen in terms of what Canadian content is. And that question comes up a lot in different capacities. So for example, on the funding level, it may be who your key creatives are, and how many CAVCO points do you get. That may be part of it. But for the audience side, and in terms of where these decisions are making at the marketing and broadcasting level, it is still zeroed in on this very white community. I and many other creators, we often get asked when pitching, how will this show, this movie relate to Mr. and Mrs. McGillicuddy in the middle of Saskatchewan or somewhere in the prairies? How will they relate to this content? And I find that now in this era that is still a very lazy approach, and very narrow approach to how we see audience as well. And I would say, even as somebody who has grown up watching a lot of white content, I always found a way to relate to them. I think I've only been to Manhattan once. I am not wealthy or anything, but I grew up and I watched Sex and the City and I related to it. I watched things on Nickelodeon, without having those type of high school and elementary school experiences, and still related to that content as well. We watch things that are fantasies, that are set in worlds that do not exist or may exist. Some people may believe that they actually are out there. And we still find a way to relate to that. So a lot of times I think that we do really need to broaden what that is, but we're still stuck in that for some reason.
So when we talk about audience, and whether that's coming from in our grants or whether it's coming from people we're pitching to or funders, how should we define it then, and how should we start to explain these things? I think people need to start using different vernaculars and different.
What I've seen a lot of is like when we talk about specifically BIPOC content, the knee-jerk reaction or the knee-jerk assumption is that only people from that specific community that the creator belongs to is the audience for that content. That's who it's for. And I really challenge creators to think further about it. And I'll use the case of something like Kim's Convenience. So the first assumption of Kim's Convenience in terms of audience would be, okay, it's Korean immigrants. That's who it will be for. And then people may see, first thing it will be Koreans, then it will be immigrants. It may be also East Asians. That's usually what assumptions are being made about who the audience is for that particular project. But when you look at Kim's Convenience, you see that at the heart of it, it's a story about a family, about an intergenerational family finding ways to exist together, to support each other, to heal from past hurts. And that is something that so many of us, beyond race, beyond age, beyond ethnicity and culture, that we could relate to. we're all part of families. We all sometimes have that brother-sister dynamic, the parents of a past generation with the kids, with the young adults who are trying to balance being from their parents' culture with this North American culture that they find themselves in right now, that so many of us could find some kind of kinship with. So that's what I really challenge creators to narrow it down to, in terms of what is really your story about. And it's where I also apply the asking why 5 times strategy.
And also
So
pulling out the themes and topics.
Yes. And
as a key. Yeah.
Yeah. And to find that and to think about who, what, and why this is for, you know? And also thinking, why are you creating this? And as you said, you know, like pulling apart the themes with that. So this is usually what I ask creators to do. What I do recognize is that so many times the people who are writers, directors, they may not have the skill set to apply this type of marketing strategy to their projects. So there is a really wide education gap.
Yes.
Around that, and that is not really being addressed.
Well, that's what we're trying to do today.
Yeah.
so thanks
until now.
Thanks for helping. Thanks for helping on this. So you have done impact producing before, and you've worked in documentaries in that way. So when we talk about impact, and when we identify communities and audience, besides theme, is there any other tips that you have for defining that and looking into research to explain our audiences? I know that's a really big question, but we're going to end on that.
It's a big one, but I think like I apply, that's where my marketing brain hits in, and also thinking like an algorithm too, like when you have to build up any type of paid ads and it's asking about who is your audience, and what may be the splinters from that as well. So I think even doing that exercise at first in terms of thinking about it. So for example, a couple of years ago, I worked on a film that was about elephant and rhino poaching in Africa, and the illegal trade of animal products. So at first like the question may be, okay, well, this is for people who care about elephants and rhinos. Then we bring it further into people who are advocates of anti-poaching, who are working in terms of the environmental field. But when we look deeper, we start to see even the impact of the poaching on local economies. We start to see how it also feeds into conflict as well. So building it into like, now it's like, it's a humanitarian cause as well. Yeah. So just trying to think about all the different areas that it could go into. And that really helped us in terms of building it out, that a lot of our supporters weren't necessarily people who cared about elephants and rhinos being killed and their horns and their tusks being taken, but they cared about animals. They cared about conflict and economic underdevelopment in Africa, and disparity, that they cared about that. Yeah. So we started to see that as well, and that really helped us in terms of broadening the audience for it as well. And then what we also saw is that there were some segments of our audience who were fine with seeing images of animals slaughtered on the ground, but we saw that there were some who did not want to see that. It didn't mean that they don't care, but they would appreciate seeing instead like the animals alive and living their life and living freely instead. So that really just affected what type of content we shared with the different audience segments.
So that's a really great example. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think that gives us some food and to think about, some morsels to think about audience and sort of impact when we think about community and those community plans that are so tied into our digital strategy these days. So we have one question from the audience I'm seeing in here for yourself. So Kaden, how do we address the structural and systemic issues that BIPOC content creators face? This is a huge one, but it's something that you're dealing with every day in organizations. So,
honesty. With honesty and transparency, that until we name it and sit in the discomfort of that naming, we will not be able to really address it. We have to acknowledge that there are disparities, that there are inequities, that these barriers exist. And we have to accept that it will feel uncomfortable. Like sometimes you may feel like, oh my gosh, I feel attacked in this moment. But then that gives you an opportunity to think, why do I feel this way about this, you know? And I know sometimes it may also feel like something that you thought was yours, that you had exclusive access to, is now being taken away from you. But then also doing that internal work as well. Like, why do you feel entitled to this over this other group of people? So I think we need to start with people being very honest about what is going on right now, and acknowledging that there are gross disparities. Recently, I read one of the CMF's latest results that showed that Black and POC-owned production companies are operating really on less than $50,000 per annum income.
That came out today, so if anybody wanted to go to CMF to see it, but it said the average is like $47,000 a year, but most BIPOC producers are getting $30,000 annually. Yes. How do you operate in that? And it says 57% are getting funds like CMF, but a lot of people are just putting in their own money. Yeah. So we're working at those lower levels and those lower budgets.
Yeah. So I think that's one thing that we need to do. We need to apply some honesty to this.
Yeah.
And then what we need, we need change at all levels.
Yeah.
That it's not only in junior positions that these inequalities exist.
Internship.
We also have to think about we also think about what leadership looks like as well, and how that affects decision making lower down the rung. So I've said before that this work that we're doing to advance equity in our industry, it requires radical change.
Yeah.
And it requires discomfort.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question with you. Do you mind taking another one?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. So there's somebody asking, what about the temptation of going toward controversial topics, or the tendency to focus on trauma porn of racialized histories? I guess as what they mean is like that being acceptable from BIPOC creators and content that people will like in the mainstream.
Yeah. I've been seeing a lot of discourse about this, specifically on Twitter, and a lot of exhaustion from Black communities, specifically Black American communities, about trauma porn and about slave narratives. And while I'm not for the complete eradication of those stories, is that what we need to do? We need to see alternative stories being greenlit and also being showcased. One of the questions that came up in that is just me and some of my other peers were like, well, these stories also exist. These ones that are not engaged in trauma porn, that are not showing like the overexploitation. The thing is that those things are not easily found. So that brings us back to discoverability as well.
Well, I think the next generation is coming up wants comedy, and I think after COVID, people want lighter. They want lighter fare, but we definitely have stories of resurgence and resilience and beauty and love. And
and I think also to ask yourself as a creator, why are you drawn to this particular story? How can you tell it with care? And I saw recently with the announcement of the Underground Railroad by Barry Jenkins, and a lot of people are like, oh my God, another slave movie. But because a lot of us trust Barry Jenkins and his storytelling, we knew that he would honor the stories, that he would not exploit our pain in that.
And so they can be nuanced. They can be nuanced. Yes, and there's beauty within the pain, right? So
exactly. So I think it also comes down to the creator too, and the relationship that they've developed with audience as well.
Sure.
But there's a certain level of care that needs to be applied in the telling of these stories. And also sometimes to think about if you should be the one telling the story.
That's a good.
Or how else can you consult with the community that's being showcased here? How can you boost your consultations with them? and maybe taking a look at your writer's room, your creative team as well. But also a key question is, am I the one who should be telling this story in this time?
I think we all need to ask ourselves this question. So I do it every day. So I think that it works for us inside, and then all those people on the outside too, who are trying to tell other people's stories, regardless. Yeah. So I'm gonna wrap it up in there. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll get some more questions hopefully at the end. I'm gonna go over to Delphine right now. Thank you, Kaden, for your words. So Delphine is here leaving. So we didn't get to talk about, we talked about sort of Canadian audiences and maybe crossing the border to America, because North America is such a bigger variety of people and audiences that we can reach, and there's more people on either side. But we have Delphine here from UK London. Thank you for joining us. I know it's a little late over there for you, but we appreciate you made the time. Delphine, if you want to tell us a bit about Gower Analytics, and then we could talk sort of about thinking globally with our audience strategy.
Yeah, sure. I've got some slides as well, so I'm just gonna pop that up on the screen. So bear with me 1 second. Thank you so much for having me. Absolutely delighted to be here. It's a little bit late, but I've managed not to fall asleep, so it's all good. So yeah, I work for a company called Gower Street Analytics. We're based in the UK, but we operate globally, including in the domestic market. And what we do is we do box office analysis, but we also do forecasting for theatrical box office as well. And we assist companies with things like release date optimization, so trying to find the best release date for their film. As more of a sort of side hustle, so to speak, I'm really engaged in diversity, just, purely based off my own experiences in the industry here, which is very white. I'm kind of keen to speak up about diversity and use the data skills that I have to empower diverse creatives, but also to kind of try and create and share some data, because as I'm sure most of the audience will know, the data is just not out there.
Yeah, and we have to build it ourselves, right? On the side
exactly.
of our face. We have to put in we have to make our anecdotes actually, number driven, and so we can kind of constantly prove ourselves and prove our audience. So I'm going to let you talk, and if you want me to ask a question.
Sure. I'll go through this, and I'm sure you might find moments to jump in or anything else. But so I kind of thought the best way to start would be just to talk a little bit about types of content data, on a really basic level. Obviously, I work with theatrical box office every day. And obviously, that's something that maybe feels inaccessible if you're outside of the industry. What I would say is ComScore, or the industry body that gather box office, but also the website Box Office Mojo, which I'm sure most people know, is free to access for the most part, and has kind of good top level information you can access if you're anyone.
Yeah, maybe we can put the Box Office Mojo up on the screen. I can ask.
Yeah, so what I would say is, obviously, when you first start looking at box office data, you might be quite daunted by it. The best way to get a handle on box office data is to look at specific films. So maybe you've got a project and you feel like, oh, this reminds me of this X film or Y film. Look up how much box office that film did that compares to your project. Kind of give you a really useful starting point. Other data that people can use for their content. This is quite film focused, but hopefully kind of applies to TV and other content. Obviously, online rental figures. I don't know how it works in Canada. We have a board that collects them in the UK. Streaming figures, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but they're incredibly unreliable, and there's not really any one set way of accessing streaming figures, but the hope really is that will change. And then things that kind of are a bit more accessible, and hopefully everyone should be able to do these kind of things, even if you're not so much got the head for things like box office and numbers, is simple things like social media likes, views, followers, and content can be really good proof of an audience, and that will come into the case study I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And likewise, any market research or audience breakdown like you're able to do is great. But again, this data is quite sparse, and also could be quite expensive if you've not got funds to kind of be doing things like market research. So again, I think we need to see the hope is that, you know, the future will bring better breakdowns of kind of audience data on that front.
And if people have websites, Google Analytics is also a way to show.
Of course, yeah. So Google Analytics is a really good way of, and that's something, I mean, I taught myself to use Google Analytics. Mm-hmm. It is possible. So I kind of thinking about what changed. A lot has changed.
Yes.
And,
understatement.
Exactly. And I would say, you know, thinking globally is more important than ever. Lots of film releases have moved to online only, which is something that people have noticed. And this has kind of brought film up to speed with what the rest of the world was doing, I'd say, because obviously we've had, you know, lots of different shorter form content online for a while now, but with film moving into that space more permanently, it'll be really interesting to see how it changes the industry. Obviously having content online, films online, means that there is wider accessibility, which can be a really good thing. And it means that you are able more than ever now to speak to a global audience. And someone earlier was talking about, you know, the idea that you're not just necessarily, your audience isn't just the community that you come from, it can be anyone. And I think that's what's worth remembering, is thinking about what's universal about your story. And the fact that you now have, complete global access really with the content you're creating. As I mentioned, at the moment, there's no industry standard for streaming data, which makes it difficult to comp titles, compare. So like I was saying earlier, if you pick a comparison film to see how it did at box office, you can't do that so much with streaming, which is causing real issues because, you know, if you've got a project that's similar to something that supposedly anecdotally did well on streaming, there's no way to prove it. Netflix post-viewing figures, a lot of those are arguably very exaggerated because they take, you know, whoever viewed the first 3 minutes of something or something like that. The hope is obviously that this is going to change. We need it now more than ever, the way things have, you know, progressed in the past few years. But in the meantime, I would say I think it's worth bearing in mind that no one has access to reliable data in that area. So hopefully you shouldn't be asked for it. And if you were, you can make a case for saying, well, there is no reliable data out there.
Unless you're coming from the streamer,
Yeah, unless you're coming from the streamer itself. But I mean, in terms of knowing what your competitors are doing, if you're at the streaming yourself, then you can compare to other titles you've done, but there's no open access kind of information. And then, one thing that's quite interesting, obviously, is there's been a real permanent change in the film industry, kind of moving on from the very traditional business model where there was a period of time a film had to stay exclusively in cinemas and couldn't be released online. And a lot of that is kind of coming to simultaneous or at least a shorter period now. Which again, I think it's just, you know, bringing film into that world that other digital content exists in, where it's like can be accessed on any platform at any time, which I think in terms of kind of reaching wider global audiences is a really promising change. So just to talk about a little bit, like I've said, like lack of data and just kind of acknowledging like what data is out there and what data isn't. It's becoming more and more of a buzzword that people want to address diversity. They want to address the lack of it, but what data is out there to prove it? Not enough. I've found in the work that I do, the US is kind of wildly better than the UK, and I'm assuming wildly better than Canada in terms.
Yes, the US is better than Canada, and Numisys is what we try to measure, what we use to measure for broadcast, and they're just saying they're putting out maybe, you know, a new version that will sort of deal with this, but that means that all these years that you can't go backwards. So
exactly. I think a couple of things I wanted to mention from the US though that I think it's worth people having a look at, or just interesting things that have crossed my eye. There's a really good report by a company called McKinsey a couple of months ago that basically, I don't know how they work this out, I would love to know. They reckon that the film and television industry could reap an additional $10 billion US.
Yeah, they calculated equity.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry to interrupt. I do have that link. Maybe my staff can put the link up on.
Yeah, sorry, I should have. Thought of. It's just one of those like last minute thoughts I threw into my presentation because I was like, oh, that'd be good to mention. But
I threw it at them yesterday, so they can put up.
Yeah,
the US report.
I think it's a really interesting report because that's the sort of stuff we need to be seeing happening everywhere, because it's proving this argument that there's no audience, there's no interest, it just completely squashes it. Also, though, exit polling, I thought I'd mention the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America, published an annual report. And that's really good. It's the only thing I've ever seen that really reliably breaks down audiences with kind of a racial profile, so to speak. And I think it's just good for getting an idea of kind of who's going to cinema. And they do have like online data, streaming data as well. So I'd just say it's worth like looking at what the MPAA have got. But yeah, we really need that level of data in, you know, other places to help us kind of continue fighting this fight. I wanted to touch a bit on kind of barriers in my own personal research and just occasional things that I've come across. So what I've been trying to do through various kind of commissions of freelance work is start working towards building a real comprehensive look at diversity in British filmmaking. The big gap I have now is that I was commissioned to do something on Black British directors. I was commissioned to do something on East and Southeast Asian. So I'm now missing all of the other elements of BIPOC that aren't included in that. So it's incomplete data, but I think it just illustrates what the situation is in the UK, which is in the past 10 years, only 2.5% of British films were made by Black British directors and only 0.8% made by East and Southeast Asian. Comparatively, the percentage of population of both of those in the UK is a lot more. So it's really shocking, and it kind of shows that, yeah, we have an incredibly homogenous industry, and incredibly kind of, it's very small and closed off, and everything you see about kind of typical British, like boys club, people who went to Oxford together, like all of that is true, and it exists in the film industry as much as it does anywhere else. Also, yeah, a lot of there's been said about this already, but outdated assumptions about audiences. The idea that, you know, who you make your content for is just your community. It can be, you know, stories can be universal and audiences can be nuanced, and films can have a primary target audience, a secondary target audience, even a tertiary target audience. You know, there's different groups. So I think
let's talk about that. Let's talk about primary. Oh, sorry. Before you get into your case study.
Yeah, no, let's go for it. Yeah, let's talk.
I would like people to kind of walk away with definitions. So we can talk about primary, tertiary, and as primary, secondary, tertiary audiences. Just how you define sort of coming up with those, what those look like, because we used to kind of just do age and gender, but people are being asked now in grants to be more specific. So do you have any tips?
Sure. So I think, yeah, age and gender obviously are the key ones, but I think it's also being more specific in terms of, you know, interests, or, so I was talking about obviously like comp titles, but you might have an idea of a certain audience, a bit like, so obviously Caden before me was talking about the documentary, and it's like, you've got people who are specifically interested in rhinos, but you've got people who are more broadly interested in animal rights, you know, for example. And I don't think, do you know what I mean? Those people can span a whole host of age and gender. But there's also, yeah, kind of focusing on maybe specific interests, or, you know, specific ways of thought, I would say.
And we say psychodemographics is part of those within that new term.
Yeah, exactly.
It just basically means interests and sort of different kinds of themes and topics.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's pulling those themes out and working out who the themes are for. Absolutely. And I think that's actually a good thing, because then, like I say, you're moving away from age and gender, and hopefully moving away from, you know, perhaps racialized descriptions as well. Yeah, so film called Blue Story. I think this might have had a small domestic release. I'm not sure how well it would have been received. So it's the film that was released in the UK towards, I've got to get my years right, towards the end of 2019. I'm sure, like everyone else, will feel that time has kind of ceased to exist a bit.
Yes.
So, I mean, this film has a really interesting personal connection to me, because it's set in Southeast London, where I grew up and I still am. You'll see, like, at the top of the poster, it says SE13, SE15. Those are zip codes, or postcodes as we call them. they're like 2 zip codes in South London. And it does present as kind of quite a typical, you know, gang story, but there's actually quite a lot more to it than that. And there's an artistic element to it. It has narration that flows through it and like elements of poetry, things like that. But what's really interesting about this film is how it was received, but also where it came from. So you'll see there's just like a little YouTube screenshot in the top left-hand corner. And this was the first piece of content posted on YouTube by Rapman, who is the guy who wrote, directed Blue Story. I don't know how many million views it had before his film was acquired. It's now 8 million. Yeah. It was definitely in the
going
millions.
up to 9 million. That's
exactly. So it was in the millions that people were going after the script. And I know this because the company I worked for at the time were one of the people that were going after this film. And I think things like this in this modern world, it's like if you've got a piece of viral content, something that you have as a creator that did really well and proves that you can speak to an audience, film companies will go mad for it. There were a whole host of companies in the UK chasing after this person, including the company I worked for, who had passed on several other, I mean, we released Moonlight in the UK, so they're not too racist, but had passed on several other Black-led projects in the past, including ones that I'd advocated for. But were adamant about getting this purely because of those YouTube views. That was it. That was enough for them. And I think it is really interesting. This was eventually acquired by Paramount in the UK, who basically were looking for more local product to bolster their slate in the UK, because they don't have that much in the way of kind of studio production at the moment. So for the first time ever, almost, a film about Black people, written by Black people, made by Black people, that, like I said, it's about suffering in the sense that it is a gang related story, but it's not, you know, these overly heavy stories of slavery or anything like that we're used to seeing, was released by a major studio in the UK. It was a huge moment. Obviously they had a lot of money to put into marketing, which you know, gave that film more of a chance than it would have done before. But what was very interesting, as you see from my news articles, is what then occurred. There was investigation done after this. Essentially, the cinema where this happened is in a very rough area. There's definitely fights there. It's called Star City, and people have renamed it Stab City, so you get the idea. The stories you hear about the levels of knife crime in the UK are not greatly exaggerated, unfortunately. And basically, it was revealed when they looked back at everything that the film wasn't even screening when this fight occurred. But what happened is that a fight occurred, the film existed, and the chain where the fight happened and another major exhibitor chain immediately pulled the film from their screens.
Because of the audience, they thought that were sorry to interrupt, but
they just assumed there's knife violence in the cinema, therefore it must be to do with this film, when actually there was no logical connection whatsoever. It was during a screening of Frozen 2, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yeah, so this, I think, shows in a nutshell the systemic racism that exists in the UK, because an immediate assumption was made. What's ironic is that obviously this caused a whole load of PR, brought the film to the attention of people who may not have been aware of it, and the film made £4.5 million at the box office, which I did a little conversion earlier, is about 7.7 million Canadian dollars, which is a lot for a film like this.
That is good for, yeah.
I think it is the highest grossing, or it's one of the, oh no, sorry, because I forget about Steve McQueen. It's in like the top 10 highest grossing films by Black British directors. So it's huge. It was a huge result, but marred by this, awful kind of thing of the structural racism that exists in the UK and the assumption. And the film was reinstated in those cinemas eventually, but there was no apology or explanation of the fact that the knife crime wasn't in any way related to the film itself. And interestingly, the person who runs the View chain, Tim Richards, has recently been made chair of the British Film Institute. So some days it feels like we're moving backwards.
Yeah, and so this is interesting. So this is the assumptions about who the audiences were from outside people that had no clue and didn't double check their facts.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly that. And yeah, it was a real shame because, you know, it was a really fantastic piece of cinema. But I'm glad that, you know, it's still got its publicity eventually, and a lot of people saw it. But I just think it's acknowledging that it's like, you can be, the industry kind of looks at these projects and go, oh, they're really hot and they're really exciting. But no matter what they do, no matter how much they buy into it, sometimes you still can't protect the content from outside forces. And this
is actually just lost money. I mean, you probably could do a study case on it losing money because of.
Oh, well, absolutely. Yeah, it wasn't screening in those 2 chains for a whole week. So, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So moving on to something a bit more, I don't want to end on kind of a down.
Yeah. So bring it back to tips for filmmakers. We have well, if we can go through this quickly, then maybe we can take one question from the audience.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I do like to ramble. It's just like really quick things. Whatever data you can get hold of, gather it, record it. If someone else, a platform or a distributor has your content, make sure they give you as much data as they have. Often directors and producers don't know to ask for that data. Take a creative approach. Obviously, like I said, a lot of the data that is being asked for might not necessarily be there, but take what you have got and see what you can do with it to prove your point.
Make some graphics, do some comparisons.
Yeah. Exactly. Whatever you can.
And hopefully we can share data amongst each other so we can kind of.
Yes, also that, actually, that's a very good point. I do this a lot in the UK, just quietly, like under the radar, sharing data that I have access to people who don't. So
I also share this data on Indigenous feature films that have been in the office.
Exactly.
What we've social. So yeah,
I would say cool. Those are kind of my tips. But yeah, let's have some questions.
Okay, so thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to have you, and I'm so fascinated by all the data stuff that you're constantly looking at every day in your job. We have a question here. So is it better to start by providing content to the local audience you know well and build from there, or is it best to start out right away in targeting a more global audience? So this kind of, we're talking about sort of spanning our international markets now that we're in this digital disruption.
I think that's a really interesting question. And it's not me trying to get out of answering it, but I would say it depends on the story.
Yeah.
I think everyone knows when you have got a really specifically niche project, because, you know, it's something that you've maybe made for yourself or you've made it for your community and therefore you know it's for sharing with them. I think if that's your aim, then by all means start with your community, and then if there is global interest, expand out to it. But I would say as much as you can, get out to it. If you look at your story and you feel that it's universal, we have the tools now to reach that global audience. Obviously, it's hard to work out how to maybe attack the whole globe. It seems like a daunting thing, but like we were saying, if you've got a specific theme, or for example, it might be an LGBT film, then you've got a way into different niche audiences across the globe. So I think it's about thinking about, again, your themes and, you know, what there is there that you can work with and who you really think it's for, and being realistic with yourself. You know, if it is a really small homegrown project, then that's great. Let it be that. If you've got broader ambitions, then by all means try and chase those and use the internet to your advantage.
Yeah, there's specific documentaries and films that are just sort of related to those communities, and it's okay to do a community. To me, it's okay to do a community impact or community events based around those sort of smaller stories. And when I'm thinking with my digital strategist brain and sort of price tags, it's really expensive. So Canada, you know, we're the size of California, so we can kind of get out our, you know, we still need a fair bit of money to get out an advertising or to do P&A in our distribution. But considering that California is, you know, the population size of Canada, that means every state has way more people. And sort of when you're beholden to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and using their set ad prices, it's going to cost way more to increase to go to millions, and to go mainstream, it costs a lot more than going niche, knowing your audience, and being really specific. And targeted with your audiences that you know. So the more you expand across geography, the more dollars you have to add. The more you expand across different segments, so like BIPOC or LGBTQ or Indigenous, then the more money you have to add in order to kind of run those specific advertisings. So I would love it if there's any other questions for Delphine, so you guys can think about that. Type it in now. We'll definitely address you at the end of the Q&A when we can open up more questions to the audience. But please, people, if you have any questions that are sort of burning, type it into the chat, and our team will take those questions in. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
Oh wait, I have one more. So I'm looking for. Okay, so this is more about a granting question that might be a local Canadian one. So maybe I'll take this.
I was going to say, please do. I'm not great at. I love watching web series, but
I am. So I'm looking for a funding series. Alok says, would you advise shooting a sizzle reel to pitch, or just use that money to shoot the first 10 minutes of an episode? So my personal advice in this is more about production than it is about sort of digital content strategy and community impact. But I would say that a sizzle reel, I've been talking to people about how useful a sizzle reel is. And sometimes when you're pitching, people like the concept and want to envision it themselves. I've been told that people like sizzle reels less because they can't sort of get into the concept and idea and sort of let their mind wander and sort of dream about your pitch in words. So I think I don't have direct advice about that necessarily, but that's what I've been told recently when I've showed up to pitches, is that the sizzle reels are being used less and less because they can kind of lock you into a look or a feel that it may not align with what the other person's thinking and what the commissioning editor or what the funder or broadcaster is thinking when you pitch. So, so that I'm going to just talk a little bit about stories first and Cool.World. So Cool.World here is we're actually developing a platform. It's a SaaS platform that's kind of a CRM, a DRM, and a place that you can actually look at content. What I really like about this is it takes audiences off social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and you can keep those audiences with you. Of course, we get people's IPs and sort of readdress audiences that are already shown that they're interested through their consent. And obviously the IPs are anonymous. But we're really trying to look at like, how do we do this in a world that has, and it expects that we have huge budgets that are like Nike, like Pepsi. Those are the people that are doing gigantic marketing and advertising campaigns on all these social networks. There's a lot of things that we're facing personally. Since the US election, I've noticed that things get flagged as political content when they're not. So using the words sometimes Black, Indigenous, or education gets flagged as a political word and can be held up in advertising. There's a huge list of words on Facebook that are sort of like banned as political, especially when the US elections were around. They didn't want to interrupt or influence anything like that. Things are becoming tougher and tougher online, where we used to find each other, and all of our communities used to connect when the pipeline was completely 100% open. And now things have really, really gotten to the point where the algorithms are kind of quashed when we try to get our own content to our own people. So this is really important. That's why you need to think around digital strategy and audiences a lot more. And you need to think about keeping that data. So set up a website, do Google Analytics, set up your own social channels for sure. But you can start to get those audiences, identify them, test materials out, and then be able to keep hopefully the same people through your career and through similar types of media content that you're making, whether it's a film, whether it's media arts, whether it's a dance film, whether it's a comedy or documentary. You really need to sort of start establishing this and taking control of the data, and that's the most important thing that that I try to work with people on. So I want to talk a bit about applications now, and talk about the language that's sort of ingrained and woven into these applications that everyone has to face. So if you're applying for CMF or telefilm and you have a digital media component, there are specific words around that. If we can get some of examples on the screen. So for the CMF, it says, tell us about the intended audience for your project, how you intend to reach So this is Creative BC, Rogers, and Doc and Factual. So inside the Creative BC, each of our provinces have our own film funding offices. Creative BC is ours in British Columbia, that tells about the audience, the intended audience for your project, and how you intend to reach that audience once your project is complete. To me, that sounds like we have to actually define who wants to see our audience. That can go into the digital content and marketing of our audience if we find them online, during COVID especially. And then how do we reach them? That can be a combination of sort of community interaction, that could be impact producing, that could be going to the communities and showing screenings, that could be doing a campaign or some making some movement around the social issues within the film. If we can put up another one, I can kind of speak to it as an example of what you may see and what I want to speak to in these grants. So the BCAC Pivot Grant says, please detail the measures planned or taken to ensure successful realization of the project, both artistically and financially. So the successful realization of the project also includes marketing and how you'll get to your sort of end user and end audience. And could we give one more example of what's in our, so the BAMP Spark application, I was part of the BAMP Fellowship, but it says describe your market according to its size, really describing your business and potentially your film production company or your small business. Go to your market strategy, including the channel and partnership, and at your key customers, and identify your key customers. So that also integrates the concepts of audience and why we have to put them and think about, well, we have to like really come up with them and think about them in context of our project, our business, who's going to watch this, and then what the broadcasters and funders would like to hear as well. So I'm going to now invite Elizabeth on. And we're going to talk about racialized. Hi.
Hi, hello.
We're going to talk about REMC. So the Racial Equity Media Collective. Thanks for joining us. I'm trying to get through a bit of why we all need to be sort of savvy on data and why data has to be more accessible to us and why we need to keep track more of our own data when it comes to getting our art or our media or our films out there. Do you want to talk a bit about your new position and how you joined REMC?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. This is such an incredible and essential panel. And yeah, I really appreciate being on this team of experts. So yeah, I am new to the world of data and research and have sort of entered it through REMC. My role as community manager has kind of come from my my previous work, working in project and event management, primarily in the film festival circuit. With a focus on community engagement and programming, and particularly interested in underrepresented artists and their stories, and particularly within that Black and Brown communities. So the Racial Equity Media Collective, REMC, is a federally incorporated nonprofit organization based in Toronto, committed to equity in film and TV all across Canada. There's sort of two main prongs to the work we do. It's data-driven research and community engagement for those who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It was founded in 2019 by 3 working BIPOC filmmakers with a mission to use evidence-based research to remove barriers to access and increase the production, export, and sustainability of BIPOC content with a lot of different kinds of initiatives, including partnerships with the Indigenous Screen Office and BIPOC TV and Film for the recent Solidarity Fund, to get Black and racialized filmmakers funding for professional development and for their projects. And within that, also acknowledging the margins of the margins, including emerging voices, aiming for regional representation, and not allocating funds to groups that had already received significant funding from Telefilm, CMF, and CCA, Canada Council for the Arts. So the reason that this focus for REMC is on research and data is that so we can have a baseline understanding of BIPOC creator situation and the way data can be used to track and measure change. So,
and this is a very different data. What we're talking about is sort of data that's collected about the interests of the audience and sort of how we can get our films made, which a lot of us don't even know how to communicate or get that into the grants, and all the grants are sort of like a show or requiring that. You guys are specifically looking at data collection around who's making the content, who's involved in the content as a priority right now.
Exactly. And then also, yeah, data coming from major funders and gatekeepers. And then also just making sure that BIPOC creators are understanding this language of those gatekeepers through data. So one thing that we do to just make it more accessible is we break down reports. So we'll probably also be doing a sort of social media analysis of the recent CMF report.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so to just begin to have those conversations in public and to make sure that these findings really are actually equitable, and to also hold these institutions accountable, and to make sure they're doing as much as they can within their power. We also collaborate with both like industry and community initiatives. So we do collaborate with Telefilm and CMF, but also like other groups here, like BIPOC TV and Film, Creators Empowered, the Indigenous Screen Office, the Black Screen Office. Yeah.
And how are you making this data more accessible to BIPOC communities? Are you guys will be publishing reports and
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess, we're both working with existing reports, and then we're also in the process of collecting data both privately and publicly to develop reports. One of the initiatives that we're starting is a BIPOC community mapping survey. So this will be for all BIPOC creators across Canada, from BIPOC-led companies. So that's production companies, organizations, collectives, things like film festivals, to ask them what their services are, what their strengths are, and what their needs are. One side of that, the details of that will feed into a report, which can kind of help sort of shape a narrative and create a story of what's happening across Canada in a way that is legible also for creators. And then the other side of that will be a directory available through the REMC website, to just have a public resource, much like Hire BIPOC, so that people know that like what all the other initiatives are.
Yes, that's on the website right now, or on the screen right now, www.re-mc.org. So you can go there to figure out what the reports will be. So you guys are more a year into this work, and I know that you're new in your position, but what trends are you noticing among barriers to BIPOC creators at this moment and time? Can you share any of the top things with us?
Yeah, for sure. So I've started doing calls around this BIPOC community mapping survey, and I've also had the pleasure of hosting some BIPOC industry town halls in partnership with BIPOC TV and Film. And yeah, there really is a lot of organizations and collectives are not feeling connected on a national level, and sometimes even on a regional level. So I think there is really a need to sort of bridge these organizations so we can, pool resources and share data and knowledge, and also just like minimize on the replicating work. There's obviously a lot of these initiatives are underfunded, as other speakers have pointed out.
Yeah, there's a huge need, huge demand right now, and there's little of us working kind of in this space because we're kind of doing advocacy and talking about these problems on the side of our desk while we're doing our full-time jobs.
Exactly. I think that's also a big thing that's become kind of clear, is that there are, like, a lot of these groups are focused on whatever the services that they're supposed to be providing, and don't necessarily have capacity, time, or energy to also then look into systemic barriers and do
analysis
work. Exactly. So it's REMC and other groups are like, we exist alongside them to support them.
Yeah, and I'm part of the Collective Bunch right now too. So the Collective Bunch is the BC version, which is started up by Jason and the whole team. So it seems like provincially we're kind of getting to that point where we notice that we need to collectively be together in order to share ideas, share data, share grant strategies, what feedback we're getting, and how we can push back and sort of make sure that we're being heard and sort of addressing these common things that are put in front of us as barriers. I was wondering if you, so yeah, the trends that you're noticing is sort of, we're probably like underfunded, under-resourced. Is there some barriers within getting grants or within getting our projects through the pipeline or the gatekeepers right now?
I actually would not be the right person to speak to that.
Yeah. But what do you hope to see in the screen sector more when it comes to sort of connecting community to industry right now? I guess that's
Yeah, there does seem like there really needs to be just more space to like have these conversations directly, whether they're public facing or private, and more space for sort of inter-community dialogues as well. There's so much within BIPOC. So just like to really just notice the sort of indiscrepancies within that and differences in resource allocation within that, and to more see just more space for those most oppressed within our systems that really are at the intersections of oppression. Yeah, whether it's race, gender, sexuality, or disability, but just really looking at the sort of systemic roots of what those issues are, and how we can create a more sustainable space for the most marginalized, that isn't tokenized and isn't one-off and isn't project-based. And yeah, because there are a lot of EDI initiatives that have come out of the last year, but also just making sure that people are sufficiently supported so they can continue in this industry.
So EDI, the equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'm just going to spell it out just in case.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's so easy.
But it is a trend right now. It's a trend, and everybody is worrying about hiring. But the content story creation and sort of the control of the IP, I think, is really yes, we need to be hired, and then we need to kind of get into the industry, and there needs to be more doors open for mid-career and but above the line too. Is there anything that you're really excited about working on right now? Like, is there anything that you want to share with us that you're sinking your teeth into or learning?
I feel like I'm learning so much already in this role, but I really like that like a lot of the groups are working together to be like sort of industry transformation groups, and that we are like in conversation and trying to sort of bolster each other's work. I think that's the most exciting thing, is that people are actively, collectively strategizing. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you for coming on, and we can't wait to see some of the reports for Racial Echo Media Collective coming out, and that data is really important. And we need to kind of refer to that in our own practice. And if people haven't seen the CMF report too, we should probably put up the CMF report. So there's a couple of general questions. If there's anything specifically for Elizabeth, please feel free to type it in to the chat. Feel free to place the question in the chat so I can ask. Okay. So any advice on how to compile, analyze data from your film website or social media? I feel like, Elizabeth, this is a bit more for me.
Yeah.
So usually you'd break it down by category. So while you're in your Google Analytics, you would kind of look at those basic things. So like Delphine had kind of said before, we're more identifying our audiences through age and through gender. Those things seem to be important, but less important than getting into specific interests or how people interact with your media. So Google Analytics, you can break down into visitors to your site, how many minutes or seconds people stayed on your site and interact with the content, where they were at before they came to your page, and then where they went to afterwards. I would also just break it down, look like, are people using their laptops or their mobile to watch your information? And then you can kind of, if you set up Google Analytics right, you can kind of see where people's geography are from. And then you get those age and gender demographics that I feel like the gender is really less accurate, because they kind of make assumptions about us and who we are. So I hope that kind of breaks it down for you. But social media usually has interest groups in the back end. You can kind of target towards interest groups or maybe other pages that are similar to what the social content or what the theme or topic or social issue is. You can kind of break it down from there and then see how successful those ads are. And you're able to measure that as well. They also have gender, they also have geography, and they also have age range as well. But I like to kind of break it down to psychodemographics a bit more. And that takes a bit of work to understand that when you're testing in the back end and keeping your audiences in the back end consistent as you advertise. And those are a bit more sophisticated tools and analysis. So I'm going to ask everybody to come back on because we have some questions coming in for our panelists, and I'd like to be able to pass it on to you. So thank you, everyone, for coming today. It was really, really engaging, and I learned so much from each of you, and I'd like to have someday sit down and we can talk more individually about these things over drinks at the next festival or something when that happens. So there's a few questions here. There's one for Shivani, if you don't mind answering.
Well, Actually, that's a question from me to you. So, and I think it might be beneficial to some of the folks that are probably tuning into this. So I would love to get your advice for someone who's emerging to mid-career, a BIPOC content creator that wants to submit a funding application, right? Because they've got a story they're totally passionate about, but they literally have no idea where to start in terms of describing their audience. What advice would you have for someone in that situation?
This is a really good, thank you, Siobhan, for putting me in the hot seat. It's good. What I say is to always kind of second guess what you think your first audience is. So be open to saying, do I actually really know? I put this audience down on paper, but how do I know that? And then asking questions around that in order to tease it out more. So a lot of the times people will guess whoever their protagonist or whoever the feature character is in their story. They'll guess that is the exact audience that's going to replicate to see their film, and that only the people want to see that person on screen. And that's not where I start. When I start with people, I usually ask them 5 questions. I don't have them up, but I'm willing to, like, everybody who's on this, everyone who's put their email in, I'd be willing to send them out so people can ask these 5 questions to themselves if they're interested. But usually I say, if you were able to sit down at a theater and sort of sit beside somebody and watch them go through this film and be moved, who would that person be? And so they at least start to describe somebody who's that they think is ideal. And then from that point, because sometimes they're describing the protagonist of the film, I say, okay, who else? Who else do you think will be moved by this? Then I try to tell them to identify and just write down a list of all the topics and themes that are inside the film. And then from those topics and themes, they break them down, and then we try to identify the audiences that would like and are interested in those themes and topics. And so that's the most basic thing and simple thing I can tell the audience right now. But it's an exercise of second guessing yourself and then kind of breaking it down into topics and theme and subject matter, and then going beyond that. That's awesome. Thank you. Thanks. So we have a couple of other questions here. So from Alok, as a BIPOC writer with ADHD, I struggle with getting a grip on data and analytics. I hear you. I'm also now neurodiverse, Alok. Any tools, tips, strategies you can recommend for neurodiverse creatives like myself to help leverage data efficiently? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of tools online that you can just make graphs. I mean, Excel is one of the harder ones, I think, but you can actually type in your numbers and then it'll make either a circle graph for you or a bar graph. And if you can't do Excel, there's one thing online called a pictograph, and you can actually just use free software. So there's a lot of these free softwares. Canva is a really good one too. That's really easy to use. I find it to be, I'm more of a visual person. So instead of typing out things into spreadsheets, or doing formulas or math, there's a lot, I find that Canva is easy, and I think it's called Pictograph. So you might want to correct me on that one. But they usually have a user option where you can use it for free for a while or for a month. So does anybody have anything else, I think, for our group here today, our group of experts? Is there anybody from the team that wants to ask something? All right. Do you guys want to? Is there anything you want to ask each other? And then I think this is it. We're gonna wrap up. Okay. So here we go. What is the future of theatrical in a post-COVID world? Pictochart. That's it. Pictochart.com. If you need to look up a really user-friendly chart. So I think that's mostly for Delphine, but Delphine, you're working a lot with the theatrical and releases and sort of, I guess, a Gower.
I can speak to that. Sorry, I was distracted for a moment. I was bookmarking Pictochart because it sounds great. I'm actually
I don't mind if you guys keep that.
To speak to Alok, I'm actually in the process of pursuing an ADHD diagnosis myself.
Yeah.
I do. I find visualizing data very good. That, and I just own a lot of fidget toys. But yeah, talking about theatrical and post-COVID world, I don't think it's going anywhere. I think the experience of watching films in the cinema is something that people are still going to want to do, especially after being locked down for so long, Also, normally in economic downturn, we find that cinema attendance actually does quite well because people can't afford things like cinema and concerts, things like that. Also, from a safety point of view, people might feel safer going to cinema than to other, live events.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, that window I think is gone now. So it used to be 16 weeks, and I think it might have been about the same, maybe a little bit less, it might have been 14 weeks in the US. And between theatrical and home entertainment exploitation. And I think it's now down to about 8 weeks. It's going to keep, there's lots of different models at the moment going on.
If you could break it down to me, like I'm like a bit younger, because I think that it's okay. So some people who've never been to theatrical, usually if you do get a distributor and you're able to get to film theaters, and in Canada sometimes you do it without a film theater, you can just hook it up individually by talking to the cinema. Usually there's like a limited time that you can go in before you get onto VOD, so video on demand. Do you want to just break that down a bit more, what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you'll be in the cinema. So like I say, this idea of a window is when you'll be exclusively theatrical. And then when that window runs out, then you can go on to VOD. But sometimes, obviously, you might have something that's already assigned to VOD, so then you've got to try and exploit the space that is available before it is on VOD. But basically, the idea that there was a lot of dead time that was happening. Basically, when the window was 16 weeks, the idea was you're actually only playing cinemas for like 4 weeks, and then you're not allowed onto VOD for another 12 weeks. So it's just tweaking the business model to basically so that people can exploit things quicker on other platforms, because we realize that cinemas, the audiences want to have choice, essentially, and it doesn't actually lose you any money. It just provides greater access.
And what do you, a lot of people are going straight to VOD right now as well.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think in this sort of post-pandemic, during pandemic, I don't want to say it's over yet, world makes a lot of sense as well. I think, especially for trying to reach that kind of global audience, or even being straight to VOD and simultaneously in theaters. I think the choice is important, and some people will still go to the cinema. So you're just getting all of that revenue in at the same time rather than delaying the revenue coming in. So I'm fully in favor of everything being on all platforms at all times. I think that's the future. That's what the future looks like.
Thank you. And in that situation where you're going to VOD, you're saying streamers, video on demand, like for rent and for purchase, places are kind of, they have the data. You can kind of ask them for that data in order to give to you. But there's ways around that too. So like with Cool.World links, we kind of decide, oh, well, we should do the advertising from our own social media, get a link so we can capture that information who's clicking through, who's actually interested in it, so we can actually keep data in-house. So we're not always relying on those VODs and those streamers to kind of give it to us. Because it's sometimes we've found when we've been marketing films lately, we'll ask like, hey, what are the numbers looking like? Because we can't get it's nice to get the numbers right in front of you, because then you can respond, adjust, test, try some more different types of graphics or different types of text, see if the response changes. But after you're waiting for a report for 4 to 6 weeks by a streamer, VOD, or somebody who's doing like rental or purchase for you, is there any tips to kind of making sure that you're able to sort of keep or hang on to that besides?
I mean,
for the information.
Some people have it contractually. You are doing the contracts, get it written into the contract that they have to provide you with certain data within a certain time frame. That's the other, and like you say, I think just using your own links as much as possible to direct people to the sites will help you capture a lot of information. And like I say, I think also just knowing to ask for it. I think as a producer and director, sometimes you're not expected to ask for this information, but if you do, I think most independent companies at least will be obliging. So just pester and ask for as much as you can.
Okay. Well, that's good. Just to keep it's always on our shoulders to keep asking and keep inquiring.
Unfortunately, yes, it shouldn't be, and we shouldn't have to do all the work. But for now, yeah.
So thank you for coming and giving our insights about UK and theatrical. A lot of our Canadian filmmakers, it's true. Kaden just types in that especially BIPOC, we don't get theatrical distribution. I also happen to be involved in Indian Horse Grizzlies, and those are Indigenous films. with content on the screen, but they're made by non-Indigenous people. But that was like the first time that we've been able to see box office for this kind of content for Indigenous audiences. So I'm planning to talk more about myself and sort of about that experience in Indigenous data on our next webinar. So that'll be June 24th. But I'm going to give you guys a bit of a wrap up and say thank you so much. I'm honored. It's such a privilege to meet all of you and to be able to hear your words. Thank you for coming today. If people would like to get out or get in contact with you, do you feel free to share that your emails or your websites? We have that on screen. Now moving on to sort of wrapping up the whole show. So thank you to Exignan. My hands are raised to all of you. Thank you to our technician. Thank you to Darcy. Thank you to Bella, Della, and Melissa for doing this. You can reach ExecDir at BIPOCTVandfilm.com for Kaden, if you guys would like to reach her. And we can put up some more information. Elizabeth Mundeno, yeah, so if the text can just put all those emails up, that would be wonderful. And I'd like to tell you a bit more about what's happening for the Cool.World series coming up. So our Cool.World Salon series will be having another webinar in 2 weeks. If we can put the graphic on the screen. So the next panel is called Tackling the 3 Cs, Colonialism, Capitalism, Corporations. This will include a free screening of the new corporation with an international panel. So that'll be happening on June 17th. If you want to mark that down and come back, you can just do the sign up at Cool.World/Salon series or Cool.World/join. And we thank everybody for coming. And the Indigenous one will be on June 24th, which happens to be Indigenous Month, Indigenous Week, which will be talking more about decolonizing digital strategies. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week, a good weekend.